The rain came down in sheets that Sunday morning, the kind of rain that turns city streets into mirrors and makes everything look like it's dissolving. She sat in the back of the town car, watching droplets race each other down the tinted window, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The driver knew not to speak to her before noon on Sundays. Everyone on her team knew. Sundays were supposed to be hers, the one day when the machine of her life paused long enough for her to remember what silence sounded like. But the car wasn't headed toward her estate in the hills. It was moving through neighborhoods she didn't recognize, past shuttered storefronts and chain-link fences, toward a part of the city where her face on a billboard would have seemed like a joke or an insult. She had told Marcus, her head of security, that she needed to clear her head. What she hadn't told him was where. What she couldn't tell anyone was why her hands were shaking, why she'd woken up at 4 a.m. with her heart hammering and her throat tight, why the walls of her bedroom had felt like they were closing in. The church appeared suddenly, a small brick building wedged between a laundromat and an abandoned grocery store. Its sign was missing half its letters, but she could make out enough to know it was called Greater Hope Baptist. The stained glass windows were dark, and there were no cars in the tiny parking lot. She told the driver to wait, ignoring his protest, and stepped out into the rain without an umbrella. The cold water soaked through her hair immediately, running down her face and neck. And for a moment, she just stood there, letting it happen, feeling something like relief. The church door was unlocked. It opened with a sound that echoed through the empty vestibule, and she slipped inside, her sneakers squeaking against the worn linoleum. The sanctuary was smaller than her living room, maybe 30 pews on each side of a center aisle that led to a simple wooden pulpit. The air smelled like old hymnals and lemon furniture polish. She walked slowly down the aisle, her wet clothes dripping, and sat in the front pew, staring up at a plain wooden cross that hung above the altar. She didn't know what she was looking for. Peace, maybe. Or permission to feel as lost as she actually felt. Her new album had debuted at #1 3 weeks ago. She'd performed for the president last month. Her face was on the cover of every major magazine, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd sung a song that felt like it meant something. The last time the music had come from somewhere true instead of from the carefully constructed instrument her voice had become. She was 34 years old and exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't touch. That's when she heard it. A voice coming from somewhere behind the pulpit, filtering through a doorway she hadn't noticed. It wasn't a powerful voice, not in the way people usually meant when they talked about power. It was raw and cracked and imperfect, but it carried something that made her spine straighten, made her breath catch. The voice was singing an old spiritual, one she'd learned as a child, and whoever was singing it like they meant every single word, like the song was the only thing standing between them and complete darkness. She stood and walked toward the sound, moving through the doorway into a narrow hallway that led to what must have been the pastor's office. The door was ajar, and through it she could see a figure sitting on the floor, back against the wall, eyes closed. A man, maybe 60 years old, with skin weathered by sun and circumstance, wearing layers of clothes that didn't match, and boots held together with duct tape. His hands rested on his knees, and he sang like he was alone in the universe, like God was the only audience that mattered. She stood in the doorway and listened. 3 minutes, 4, 5. When the song ended, the silence that followed felt sacred, and she found herself afraid to break it. But he opened his eyes and looked directly at her, and there was no surprise in his face, no shock at seeing one of the most famous women in the world, standing in a doorway dripping rainwater onto the church floor. He just looked at her with eyes that were clear and sad and knowing. "You're lost," he said. It wasn't a question. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, to do what she'd been trained to do, which was deflect and redirect and keep the armor intact. But something about this moment, this place, this stranger with the ruined voice that somehow held more truth than any technically perfect performance she'd heard in years, made the armor crack. She nodded. "Me too," he said. "Been lost for about 15 years now. But I found this place, and they let me come in here on Sunday mornings before service. Let me sing a little bit. It helps." She stepped into the room and sat down on the floor across from him, not caring about her designer jeans, or the fact that she had a photo shoot scheduled in 3 hours. "What's your name?" she asked. "Samuel," he said. "But most people just call me Sam." "You're Whitney Houston," she smiled, just a little. "Yeah, I am. I know your music, he said. My daughter loved your music, played it all the time. He paused, and something passed across his face, a shadow of pain so deep she felt it in her own chest. She died 8 years ago. Car accident. After that, I kind of stopped participating in life, you know? Lost my job, lost my house, lost my way. But I kept singing. It's the only thing that makes me feel like I'm still a person. They sat there in that small office, two people from completely different worlds, connected by the strange mathematics of grief and music. She asked him about his daughter, and he told her stories that made her laugh and then made her cry. He asked her why she was really there, in this church, on this morning, and she found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone, about the pressure and the expectations and the way her voice sometimes felt like it belonged to everyone except herself, about how she'd started to wonder if the gift had become a curse. Sam listened without judgment, without advice, without trying to fix anything. When she finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You want to know what I think? I think you forgot why you sing. I think you got so good at it that it stopped being prayer and started being performance. And there's nothing wrong with performance, but if that's all it is, it'll hollow you out eventually." The words hit her like a physical thing. She felt tears coming and didn't try to stop them. She let them fall, and Sam didn't look away, didn't seem uncomfortable. He just sat there, bearing witness to her breaking open. "Sing with me," he said after a while. "Right here, right now. No one's listening except God, and he don't care if you hit the wrong notes." She almost laughed. "I don't think I know how to hit a wrong note anymore. That's part of the problem." "Then try," he said. "Try to sing it imperfect. Try to sing it like you're talking to someone you love who's dying. And this is the last thing you'll ever get to say to them. Technique doesn't matter. Perfection doesn't matter. Just let it be true." So they sang together, sitting on the floor of that tiny office, their voices weaving around each other in ways that no producer would have approved, that no audio engineer would have allowed. His voice cracked and wavered, and she let hers crack too. Let it break and reform. Let it be messy and uncertain and absolutely devastatingly real. They sang Amazing Grace, and then they sang Precious Lord, and by the time they finished, she was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, and it felt like something that had been locked inside her for years was finally breaking free. When they stopped, Sam reached over and put his hand on her shoulder. "That's the voice," he said quietly. "That's the one you've been looking for? Don't let anyone take it from you again." She looked at him, this stranger who had somehow become the most important person she'd met in years, and made a decision that would change everything. "I want to record with you," she said. "Not for an album, not for release, just for us. I want to document this, what just happened. Will you come with me?" Sam frowned. "I don't think that's a good idea. I'm not a professional, and you've got a life, responsibilities. This moment was beautiful, but maybe it should just be a moment." She shook her head fiercely. "No, I need this. I need to remember this feeling, and I need to understand how to get back to it. Please, just one session. I have a studio. We can do it today." He looked at her for a long time, and she saw him weighing something in his mind, some calculation between hope and fear. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, one session. But I'm doing this for you, not for me. I don't need anything from this except to help you find your way back." The drive to her private studio took 40 minutes, and she spent most of it on the phone with Marcus, who was losing his mind about the security breach, about the unknown person she'd brought into her car, about every protocol she was shattering. She told him to stand down, told him this was happening whether he liked it or not, told him in a voice that surprised even herself that she was still in charge of her own life. Marcus backed off, but she could hear the worry in his silence. Sam sat quietly in the car, looking out at the city as they drove through neighborhoods that got progressively wealthier, the buildings getting taller and newer, the cars getting more expensive. He didn't say anything, but she could sense his discomfort growing, could see him pulling into himself. By the time they reached the studio, a converted warehouse in an industrial district that she'd bought and renovated 5 years ago, he looked like he was regretting his decision. The engineer on duty, a young guy named Tyler, who'd worked with her for 2 years, took one look at Sam and then at her, and she could see all the questions forming in his mind. She cut them off before he could speak. "We're recording today, just us. Set up 2 mics, live, no separation. I want it to sound like we're in a room together, because we are. No effects, no processing, just capture what happens. Tyler nodded slowly, professional enough not to question her judgment out loud, but she could see the skepticism. He'd been trained in the church of technical perfection, in the religion of a pitch correction and multiple takes and flawless execution. What she was asking for went against every instinct he had. She took Sam into the main recording room, a space with hardwood floors and acoustic panels and a baby grand piano in the corner. The gear alone in this room was worth more than most people made in a decade, and she watched Sam take it all in, watched him shrink even further into himself. This was a mistake, she thought suddenly. I'm making him feel small. I'm making this about me again. But then she did something she hadn't done in years. She sat down on the floor, right there in the middle of the studio, and patted the space next to her. Sam looked confused but sat down beside her. "Tyler," she called out toward the control room. "Can we get mics down here, on the floor?" There was a pause, and then Tyler's voice came through the speakers. "Seriously?" "Seriously," she said. It took him 10 minutes to set up, running cables and positioning 2 expensive microphones aimed at their spot on the floor. The whole time, she and Sam didn't talk. They just sat there, breathing, letting the strangeness of the situation settle into something that felt almost normal. When Tyler gave them the thumbs up through the glass, she looked at Sam and said, "What do you want to sing?" He thought about it. "Something my daughter loved, something that meant something to her. Do you know his eye is on the sparrow?" She smiled. "I know it. Let's sing it like she's listening." What happened next would haunt her for the rest of her life, but not in the way pain haunts. It would haunt her the way beauty haunts, the way a perfect moment can burn itself into your memory, and become the standard against which everything else is measured. They sang together, and it wasn't about vocal runs or showing off or hitting impossible notes. It was about 2 broken people finding their way towards something that felt like grace. Sam's voice was rough and imperfect, and she let hers be rough too, let it crack and strain and reach for notes it didn't quite make. And in those imperfections, in those vulnerable spaces between what was planned and what actually happened, something true emerged. They sang for 2 hours. They sang hymns and spirituals and old soul songs. They sang some things twice, some things 3 times, not because they were trying to get it right, but because they weren't ready to let the song go yet. Tyler sat in the control room with tears running down his face, not even pretending to maintain professional distance anymore. This wasn't a recording session. It was a ritual, a ceremony, a holy thing happening in a space that had seen 1,000 manufactured performances but had never witnessed anything quite like this. When they finally stopped, exhausted and wrung out and strangely peaceful, she looked at Sam and said, "Thank you. You gave me something I didn't know I needed." He smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, the sadness in his eyes seemed lighter. "You gave me something too," he said. "You reminded me that the music doesn't die just because the people we love do. It keeps going. It has to." She wanted to keep him there, to make him part of her world, to turn this into something ongoing. But she could see that he was already preparing to leave, already pulling back into himself, in preparation for returning to whatever life he'd been living before this morning. She made him promise to come back, to let her help him find housing, to let her connect him with resources. He agreed, but she could see in his eyes that he was just being kind, that he had no intention of taking her up on it. This was a moment for him, not a beginning. Marcus drove Sam back to the church district, and she stood in the studio watching the car disappear down the street, feeling something between gratitude and grief. Tyler came out of the control room carrying a hard drive. "I bounced everything down," he said quietly. I don't even know what this is, but it's the most real thing I've ever recorded. What are you going to do with it?" She took the hard drive and held it like it was made of glass. "I don't know yet, but I know I can't release it. This wasn't for the world. This was for me." Over the next 3 weeks, she listened to those recordings every day. She listened to them in her car and in her bedroom and on planes between tour stops. She listened to them instead of her own albums, instead of the radio, instead of anything else. And slowly, something inside her began to shift. She started making changes. She fired her vocal coach, the one who'd been polishing her technique into something increasingly inhuman. She told her label that the next album would be different, simpler, more stripped down. They resisted, of course. They wanted the Whitney Houston formula, the big ballads and the vocal acrobatics and the maximum commercial appeal. She told them they could have that or they could have her, but they couldn't have both anymore. The pushback was immediate and intense. Conference calls filled with executives telling her she was making a mistake, that she was jeopardizing her career, that the market wanted one thing from her and she was refusing to deliver it. Her manager threatened to quit. Her producer said he couldn't work under these constraints. Even some of her bandmates seemed confused, uncertain whether this was a creative evolution or a breakdown. But she held firm, and in the quiet moments when doubt crept in, she would listen to those recordings again, to the sound of her voice cracking and breaking and being absolutely undeniably real. She would hear Sam's rough, imperfect instrument weaving around hers, and she would remember what it felt like to sing like prayer instead of performance. She tried to find him. She went back to Greater Hope Baptist every Sunday for a month, but he was never there. She asked the pastor, a kind woman in her 50s who said she remembered Sam but hadn't seen him in weeks. She hired a private investigator who spent 2 months searching and came up empty. It was like Sam had been a ghost or an angel or a figment of her imagination. But the recordings proved he'd been real, proved that the moment had happened, proved that she hadn't invented the entire encounter in some desperate fever dream. The unauthorized leak came on a Tuesday. She was in London for a promotional tour when her publicist called at 3 a.m, her voice shaking. Someone had accessed the studio servers and stolen the recordings. They were online, spreading across file-sharing networks and message boards, being downloaded thousands of times per hour. The audio quality was perfect because Tyler's equipment was perfect, and now the entire world could hear Whitney Houston singing like she'd never sung publicly before, vulnerable and raw and utterly exposed. The response was immediate and divided. Some people were confused, saying she sounded tired or strained or unprofessional. Music critics wrote think pieces about whether this represented a decline in her abilities. But others, thousands and then tens of thousands of others, heard something different. They heard truth. They heard humanity. They heard an artist who'd been trapped inside the prison of her own perfection, finally breaking free. The recordings went viral, not as a novelty but as a revelation, proof that even the most technically accomplished vocalist in a generation was still, fundamentally, a person searching for meaning through song. Her label panicked and demanded she issue a statement condemning the leak, distancing herself from the recordings, framing them as unauthorized and unfinished work product. Her lawyer drafted language calling for legal action against whoever had stolen and distributed the files. But when she read the statement, sitting in her hotel room overlooking the Thames, she couldn't bring herself to approve it. Instead, she wrote her own statement, one that her team begged her not to release. The statement said, "These recordings were made in a moment of deep personal searching. They were never intended for public release, and their distribution without my consent is a violation. But I won't disavow them. They represent something true about where I was and where I'm trying to go as an artist." The man singing with me is named Samuel. He gave me a gift that morning, and if you're listening to these recordings, I hope you'll hear it not as a product, but as a prayer. I hope wherever Sam is, he knows how much that day meant to me. The statement exploded across social media and news outlets. Everyone wanted to know who Sam was, wanted to find him, wanted to turn him into the next viral sensation. The church where they'd met was suddenly famous, besieged by journalists and fans and people hoping to have their own magical encounter. The pastor did interviews explaining that they'd always tried to be a sanctuary for people experiencing homelessness, that Sam had been one of dozens who'd found brief refuge in their doors over the years. And then, a week after her statement went public, Sam appeared on a local news segment. He looked older, more tired, but it was definitely him. The interviewer asked him what it was like to record with Whitney Houston, whether he felt exploited or manipulated, whether he wanted money or recognition. He listened to all the questions with patience, and then he said simply, "She was hurting, and so was I. And we helped each other for a few hours. That's all. I don't want anything except for people to leave that morning alone and let it be what it was. She doesn't owe me anything. I don't owe anyone anything. We made something beautiful and private, and I wish it had stayed that way." Watching the interview from her home, she felt tears streaming down her face. She had her team track down contact information for the news station, and she spoke to Sam on the phone that evening. She apologized for the chaos, for the exposure, for everything spiraling so far beyond what either of them had intended. He accepted her apology with grace, but she could hear the weariness in his voice, the way the attention had worn him down. "I want to make this right," she said. "Let me help you. Please." "You already did help me," he said. "That morning in the church, you helped me. Everything since then has just been noise. But I'll accept your help if it means people will stop looking for me. I just want to be left alone." She set him up in a small apartment, paid for a year up front through a charitable trust, so his name wouldn't be connected to hers publicly. She arranged for support services, for health care, for someone to check in on him weekly, but not intrusively. She did it all quietly, through intermediaries, respecting his desire for privacy. And then she let him go, understanding that some people enter your life to teach you something and then need to exit just as quickly before the lesson gets diluted by proximity. The controversy around the recordings eventually faded, replaced by the next scandal, the next viral moment. But the impact lingered. Her label reluctantly agreed to let her make the album she wanted to make, the one that prioritized emotional truth over technical perfection. It was called Bare, and it divided audiences. Some longtime fans felt betrayed by the stripped-down production and the more vulnerable vocal performances. But others, especially younger listeners who discovered her through the leaked recordings, embraced it as her most honest work. It didn't sell as well as her previous albums, but it won critical acclaim and earned her a different kind of respect. She performed differently after that too. She started taking long pauses between songs and concerts, talking to audiences about what the music meant instead of just delivering hit after hit with precision and polish. She started inviting other artists on stage, lesser-known singers who reminded her of Sam, people whose voices carried something raw and unprocessed. Her shows became unpredictable, electric with the possibility that anything could happen, that perfection might give way to something more valuable. But privately, in the moments when she was alone, she wondered about the cost of her transformation. She'd lost some fans, some commercial viability, some of the armor that had protected her from the full weight of public scrutiny. She'd made herself vulnerable in ways that couldn't be undone, and vulnerability, she learned, was exhausting. Some nights she would lie awake and question whether she'd made the right choice, whether the pursuit of artistic authenticity was worth the sacrifice of stability and success. Then she would listen to those recordings again, to the sound of two broken people finding temporary grace in song, and she would remember why she'd started singing in the first place. Not for the awards or the accolades or the ability to hit notes no one else could hit. She'd started singing because it made her feel connected to something larger than herself, because it transformed pain into beauty, because it was the language she spoke when words failed. 5 years after that Sunday morning in the rain, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter on notebook paper and a small silver harmonica. The letter was from Sam's pastor. It said that Sam had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks earlier, and that before he died, he'd asked that this harmonica be given to her. It had belonged to his daughter, who'd played it constantly as a child. The pastor's letter said Sam wanted her to know that he'd listened to the leaked recordings only once, that hearing them had made him proud and sad in equal measure, and that he'd thought of her often over the years, hoping she'd found whatever she was looking for. She held the harmonica in her hands and wept, not just for Sam, but for his daughter, for all the beauty that gets lost, for all the moments that can never be recaptured. She wept for her younger self, the one who'd thought perfection was the goal, who hadn't understood that the cracks were where the light got in, and she wept with gratitude for a chance encounter on a rainy morning that had given her permission to be imperfect, to be human, to be enough. At her next concert, she told the story. Not all of it, not the private parts, but enough. She told thousands of people about meeting a stranger in a church, about singing together on a studio floor, about learning that technique without truth was just empty exercise. And then she sang, "His eye is on the sparrow," not with all her technical mastery, but with all her heart, letting her voice crack where it wanted to crack, letting it be messy and mortal and magnificent in its honesty. The audience was silent when she finished, and in that silence she could feel something shift, some collective recognition that they had witnessed not just a performance, but a testimony. And then they began to applaud, not the polite appreciation of technical achievement, but the wild, sustained applause of people who'd been given permission to be imperfect too, to bring their broken selves to the music and find that they were welcome there. She never found out who leaked the recordings, and eventually she stopped caring. Maybe it was Tyler, overcome by the beauty of what he'd captured. Maybe it was someone who hacked the studio servers looking for valuable material to sell. Maybe it was the universe itself, insisting that some moments are too important to remain private, that some lessons need to be shared. Whatever the reason, she came to see the leak not as a violation, but as an odd sort of grace, an unexpected gift that had forced her hand and made her choose between the person she'd been and the person she needed to become. In her dressing room after shows, she kept a small framed photograph that a fan had found online and sent to her. It was a picture of a young girl, maybe 12 years old, with Sam's eyes and his smile, his daughter. The fan had found it through genealogy research, had tracked down the one public record of Sam's family. She never confirmed whether it was really her, but she believed it was, and she kept the photograph as a reminder that everyone is carrying losses too heavy. To name, that grace can show up in the strangest places, that the point of music was never to prove your abilities, but to create a momentary shelter from the storm. She still sang the big songs, still delivered the ballads that audiences expected, but she sang them differently now, with an awareness of their weight and their purpose. She understood that her voice was a gift, but the gift wasn't just the technical ability. The gift was the responsibility to use it in service of something true, to create moments of connection and recognition, to remind people that they weren't alone in their struggles and their searching. Years later, when journalists asked her about the defining moment of her career, they expected her to name a particular award or achievement, a record-breaking album, or a legendary performance. Instead, she talked about a rainy Sunday morning and a stranger in a church, about sitting on a studio floor and learning to sing imperfectly, about the gift of being seen by someone who had nothing to gain from seeing her. She talked about Sam, about his daughter who loved to sing, about the way grief and music were sometimes indistinguishable from each other. And when people asked what happened to the recordings, whether they'd ever be officially released, she smiled and said no. Some things were too sacred to be products, too important to be reduced to commercial transactions. Those recordings existed as they were meant to exist, as evidence of a moment that changed her, as proof that vulnerability could be a kind of strength, as a love letter to the strange and unexpected ways that grace finds us when we need it most. The rain still came down on Sunday mornings, and she still thought about that day, about the sound of Sam's voice weaving around hers, about the way they'd created something together that neither of them could have created alone. She thought about how close she'd come to missing it, to driving past that church, to staying locked inside her own misery and fear. She thought about all the moments we almost miss, all the grace we almost refuse, all the teachers who appear in forms we don't recognize. And she kept singing, not because she had to, but because she chose to, not to prove anything, but to connect with something, not with perfection as the goal, but with truth as the compass. She kept singing for Sam and for his daughter, for everyone who'd ever felt lost and found temporary shelter in music, for herself and for the younger version of herself who'd needed permission to break and be beautiful anyway. She kept singing because it was the only language that made sense of the world, the only way she knew to turn suffering into something that might help someone else survive their own dark Sunday mornings. The harmonica stayed on her nightstand, a reminder that every person we meet is carrying something precious and something broken, that kindness doesn't require understanding, that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply show up and sing, alongside someone who needs to remember they're not alone. And on quiet nights, when the world was asleep and the pressure of being Whitney Houston finally lifted, she would hold that harmonica and whisper thank you to a stranger who'd given her back her voice by teaching her it was okay to let it break.